Hello YouTube. Today I want to talk about the Browning high power. Specifically, I want to talk about parts compatibility between the different variations of high powers that were made throughout the years. Contrary to popular opinion, high powers are not completely interchangeable as far as the parts are concerned, unless you do things as an assembly and understand where the various changes were made and how they may affect the pistol that you own. For examples, I have a couple of high powers here. One of them is my English high power. I've shown this in an earlier video. And this one here is my Hungarian high power. Again, I've shown this in an earlier video. And we're going to use these as comparison points because the clone guns are basically the same as the FN produced Browning high powers. A lot of the parts, almost all the parts actually, are interchangeable between the guns. And we'll get into that. We're going to start with the very earliest high powers, and prior to 1950. This will cover from the startup of production up to about 1950. And what these guns had were an internal extractor. If you're familiar with the 1911 A1, much the same kind of extractor as that gun. They used a flat top sear, which can be seen right here. They use a long tab trip lever, up here, sear trip lever, up in the slide. The hammer hole is actually lower. I have a hammer here that was originally on my Hungarian high power that somebody thoughtfully cut down in an effort to keep it from biting the web of their hand. But the hammer hole was actually lower, down around here on these earlier guns. And the hammer strut was different. This one here is a post-war version. And if you see this part here, where it's angled off, on the earlier guns this was a U shape. And this was also set up to accommodate the lower hole in the hammer. So these two parts right off on the pre-war guns are not interchangeable with the post-war guns unless you do them as an assembly. You can put a pre-war hammer strut spring assembly into a post-war gun. You can put a post-war hammer assembly with the strut and spring into a pre-war gun. But you can't mix the parts. You can't mix a hammer with a strut, vice versa. So that's one of the major changes right there. When it comes to English, during the wartime, these guys' guns they had several changes made in them to improve the reliability and parts compatibility with the FN made product. They changed the extractor height. They changed the location of the the ejector height. They changed the location of the extractor. Lowered that down a little bit to improve extraction. And they did some magazine dimensional changes. When English first started producing the guns, their magazines wouldn't work. And they learned how to change that magazine geometry. They got a proper functioning magazine. This is an actual English magazine here. I don't know if that'll show up on the camera or not, but JI mark down here. And these magazines are completely interchangeable with any FN magazines or any outsourced magazines, and they can be used in any FN type high power. So did a lot of changing on them in a very short production period. English only produced the guns for about a year and a half. So in 1950, some of the major changes came about. Browning redesigned the gun. They were looking to improve the accuracy and reduce the hammer pull and the gritty feeling on the trigger. And one of the major things that was done on the barrel here, they've changed this dimension. This one here, which is an English, is a wartime barrel, and this slot right here is 5.5 millimeters. And what they did in 1950 is reduce that diameter plus the fitted lug up here in the frame to 5.04 millimeters. There you go, right there. To tighten up the barrel tolerance a little bit, improve the accuracy. Another thing that they did was to change the magazine safety pad. Let's see if we can get a picture of that. Down in here, they've changed the actual magazine safety pad down here, made it larger, and they incorporated a cutout into the frame here to accommodate that larger pad, and that spread that trigger pressure out a little bit, reduced the gritty feeling on the pressure. Consequently, your pre-war type magazine safety is not interchangeable with a post-war magazine safety, and you can interchange a post-war magazine safety with a pre-war magazine safety unless you make cutouts in the frame. Most people aren't going to do that, so if you get a pre-war or wartime gun that's missing the magazine safety, you're going to have to locate a pre-war magazine safety pad, or it's not going to work. It's not going to function. It's going to hang up. One of the things I forgot to talk about, the barrel. The very early FN made guns had a rounded slug slot in here. They changed that in 1938 to the square lug. They realized this increased the bearing surface and prevented the lug down here from cracking or shearing off entirely. English changed it about mid 1944. Their earliest guns did have U slots on them. It took them a little bit to get up to speed with FN, understand the changes that had been made. Once they were realized, they went ahead and started using the square lug type barrel cutout. And this is the type of cutout that's remade. Again, all barrels prior to 1950 are going to be 5.5 millimeters in this cutout. Everything after 1950 is going to be 5.04. Now the good news is you can buy a post-war barrel and simply have the slots machined open. A gunsmith can do that to the 5.54 millimeter dimension, and you can fit a post-war barrel into a pre-war gun. So it's not a major thing, but you have to be aware of that when you go to fit a barrel. They're not, in most cases, drop-in compatible. Barrels really have to be fitted in high powers. Okay. Other major changes. Let's see, 1958, they improved the sear and the sear trip lever. Let's see if I have a sear here. Now, if you notice, I mentioned before that the earlier guns have this flat sear trip lever. And in 1948, or I'm sorry, 58, they started incorporating a little pad on the top of the sear lever on top of the sear. Consequently, they lengthened the sear trip lever, or shortened the sear trip lever on post-war guns so that it fit correctly with this type of a sear. So, if you go to replace a sear in a pre-war gun or a wartime gun, most likely you're going to get a newer type sear, and you're going to have to replace the sear trip lever up here in the slide with a post-war. No big deal. Even though the extractors are different between the two guns, the sear trip levers will align and fit just fine. Very minimal fitting, but you have to incorporate the two of them as an assembly to get it to function correctly. Okay, 1962, FN started to incorporate what's called a visible extractor, spring type, simpler extractor, easier to install. Doesn't require its own spring tension on the extractor like the 1911 type. There's an internal coil spring inside, much longer, much better lasting, much longer wearing extractor assembly. And let's see what else they did. The British guns, English, started going through factory thorough repair. During this time, they may have incorporated new sears and new trip levers, or they may not. It depended on how badly the gun was worn. So it's one of those things to be aware if you happen to own an English. Take a hard look at it, especially one that's been factory thorough repaired. You can tell that by the markings up here on the slide, or it'll say FTR 62, and usually gives the Enfield Armory mark on there. So you have to look at that and know. Also, they may have changed the hammer assemblies. They'll still be rounded hammers, but they may be using the new style hammer, the new style strut assembly. So when you take one apart, you need to look at it and be sure which one you have in there before you make any changes to it. Okay, in 1965 they standardized the pattern, what was called the British pattern. Guns were coming out then, they were standard with black plastic grips. A lanyard ring was standard. You had to specifically request guns without the lanyard ring. If you didn't, it'd come automatically with a lanyard ring. And they started to use this parkerized, or paint over parkerized finish. Became standard on all high powers. This was originally done with the Inglis. FN liked it, decided it was a good long wearing finish, and they started incorporating it on their own guns. You had to specifically order the gun as high blued. They could also be ordered in chrome, nickel, gold plate, or engraved, but specifically they had to be ordered as such, or the guns would be provided with a paint over parkerized finish. In 1973, some other changes were made. Basically, they began using the spur hammer on the guns, and they also incorporated a muzzle bushing, a large muzzle bushing here, to better protect the muzzle of the gun from damage from being knocked or dropped or beat around, and just made the gun, kept the accuracy standard of the gun better protected the muzzle. Sights. There's several different types of sights on high powers. There's 3 different ways of having the front sights installed, 4 different ways if you count the dovetails. If you ever go to do sights, if you have a beater type pistol and you want to replace sights, I highly recommend having something along the style of a 1911 sight installed. If you're looking to preserve an original pistol, you're going to have to understand what type of front sight procedure was used to put the sight in place, and then you're going to have to duplicate that procedure. So one thing to be aware, they're basically similar. There's a silver soldered, there's a staked and silver soldered, and then there's just staked. So once you figure out which one of the 3 was used, it's pretty easy to find a front sight of the type and put that on the gun. And this on the Hungarian high power, in about 1990, 91, 92, they started putting this type of a slide stop on. It's a shortened slide stop. This slide stop is not kind of sort of, you can put this on an older style gun and get it to work, but you cannot put the high power style slide stop on one of these and get it to work. The cutout's different, and these will just not function, and they won't work at all. So you have to use this style of slide stop with these newer Hungarian guns. They also used a safety, I think I have one. They started putting, let's see if I can find one here. An extended slide safety on there, and these are interchangeable. These can be used on any high power. If somebody likes them, I'm not particularly enamored with them. I didn't like it. I thought it was sloppy and had a little loose fitting. I went ahead and put a FN safety on mine. I don't have any problem with the smaller safety. It works fine for me. And on my Hungarian, which came with that rounded hammer, I went ahead and replaced it with the spur type hammer because I like these better. They greatly reduce the possibility of hammer bite on the web of your hand. I have a fairly large hand, so, and it fit right up with the Hungarian. Every part I've ever done on a Hungarian, I've generally used FN Browning parts on, and they fit just fine. And frankly, on these guns, I found that a lot of the pins, the sears, they tend to be softer metal than what you would get on the actual FN. So whenever I do any work on these, I just automatically replace any of those parts with FN made parts. Work just fine, fit just fine. So in 1981, through my notes here, they went to a Mark II. I don't have an example of that pistol, but basically all they did with the Mark II is added an ambidextrous safety, and they improved the sights. Now again, back to the sights, different dovetail cutouts on the Mark II, so standard Browning sights won't fit. You have to use Mark II style sights or have the dovetails cut out for another type of sight. The ambidextrous safety that was incorporated on them, absolutely interchangeable with all other high powers. If you want an ambidextrous safety, I'd recommend using the DFN safety. And it's not the greatest design in the world, but it does work rather well. Again, I'm not a big fan of them, so I've never felt the need to use one. And then in 1988, the Mark III standards were adopted. They incorporated improved 3-dot sights, which the Hungarian actually uses 3-dot sight. It's very, very good, but it's kept the lower sight profile of the original high power. These are actually my favorite sights that I've ever used on a high power. Really, really good. So, and they put a firing pin safety in there. Again, that's going to affect some of the internal parts compatibility. I'm not totally familiar with exactly what fits on the Mark III, so that's one another gunsmith will hopefully cover in some other video. They use a stronger hammer spring, trigger spring, and a heavier weight recoil spring on the Mark IIIs. They improve reliability with short primers and things like that. So, or hard primers. They also recontoured the barrel ramp profile, made feeding a little better. So, there you go. There's some of the things that you need to be aware of if you're going to work on a high power. I hope you found the video helpful, and thank you for watching.